The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts and guests as individuals and do not necessarily reflect those of advertisers or sponsors. This podcast is about cannabis, the possession or use of which may be illegal in your state or location. Always check your local or state laws before acquiring cannabis. This podcast may include profanity and what some may consider adult themes. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer, the cannabis-centric show with a little something for everyone. Herer'S Victory Garden is brought to you by PodSquadPDX.com, painless podcasting, by the Narrowband Broadcast Network, NBBN, the focus is on you, and by the support of our listeners, followers, and subscribers via Patreon. Patreon. Create on your own terms. On this episode, young Chris discovers Candyland, Andrew invokes the ghost of both his mom and Richard Nixon, and Mark laughs with a gun in his face. All that and more on this episode of Herer'S Victory Garden. Smoke 'em if you've got 'em. Here's your host, Andrew Scott.
Hello and welcome to Herer'S Victory Garden, the cannabis-centric show for everyone. Hey, do us a big favor. You know how it goes. Like, share, subscribe. We're happy to do this for our friends all around the world, but we sure need your support, so give us a click, thumbs up, I don't know, send us a pony. I'm your host, Andrew Scott, along with my good friend and co-host, Chris Ritter, and the man for whom this show is named, Mark Herer. How you doing, Mark?
Fabulous. Good morning, guys.
Good morning to you. Morning, Chris.
Good morning, guys.
And this is our inaugural episode. More than anything, I think we're just here to have a good time and talk about our favorite topic, but at the same time, maybe educate and help demystify and destigmatize our favorite plant. This episode is brought to you by Pod Squad PDX along with the Narrowband Broadcasting Network. And let's go. We're going to do a quick little roundtable here about how we all came to this wonderful plant. As I said, my name is Andrew Scott, and I've been a cannabis user for the better part of 40 years. I'm 51 now. I do have a disability. And it really does help with my particular disabilities. I broke my neck when I was younger, and it helps with spasticity and all sorts of other things. Chris, how did you come to use cannabis?
Yeah, so, as far as cannabis usage, I'm very much a lightweight. I used a little bit in high school and college. I quit in college and sort of came back to it very lightly. Once it became legal in Washington State and then in Oregon. My interest in the culture and what really drew me to it more was the sort of the gear and the culture around it. That's where I started when I was 14 and walked into my first head shop. I was like a kid in a candy store.
Candyland.
Yeah. I mean,
all these things I shouldn't have.
And it was always amazing to me that as a teenager, that I was allowed to walk into a head shop, but they pointed out, we're not selling anything illegal. Right. This is just paraphernalia. So, that's where I really got interested. And then once I got into college, I started to understand the bigger picture of, what was going on around cannabis. And, I've sort of been a lifelong activist in various different ways. And what I saw was, just something profoundly incorrect and profoundly absurd. And so I decided to sort of put my shoulder to the wheel and step in and help, even though it wasn't of huge personal use interest to me. It
wasn't a passion of yours at that point.
Yeah. I mean, outside of the cultural piece.
Right. Very good. And so, Mark, this is your podcast. This is your soapbox. So how did you wind up in this life in 5 words or less? Go.
From the time I was 7 till about 12 years old, I had asthma so bad I often would cry myself to sleep at night. Literally, crazy child thoughts, wishing I would die because it was really that hard to breathe. I was allergic to everything under the sun. My allergies triggered my asthma. For years, my dad, who was already a smoker at that time, this was 1972, had really wanted me to try smoking pot because he heard some really good things about it and he thought it could possibly help. So when I was 12, maybe 13, somewhere between 6th and 7th grade, I smoked pot for the first time. Out of a little bing with my brother. It was about 1.5 inch in diameter and about 6 inches tall. I took 3 hits. First one, I coughed my ass off. Second one, I held it. It was awesome. And third one, I coughed my ass off again. We were watching Bugs Bunny, and I remember falling asleep on my head, standing on my head, leaning up in the corner on my bed, and passed out laughing my ass off.
That's a perfect introduction.
Exactly. So my dad was like a proud grandfather when he heard I first smoked pot, because that was the last time that I actually had a major asthma attack in my life.
In your life?
In my life.
There you go. It's interesting that you bring up the asthma, because my mother, rest her, she was born in 1930. Back in the days when they were still able to prescribe cannabis hemp for anything. And my mother always would tell us that she had a little tin. She grew up with a little tin, kind of like an Altoids tin, and it would have her medicated flowers in it. And back in the day, the treatment was, and this was often given to girls with asthma for some unknown, overly specific gender reason, a little coal cake, and you would put a flower on it, and you throw a towel over your head, and you breathe in the vapors. And as us kids all got a little older, my mother always would say, "I wonder what happened to that little tin. I never finished it." And all us boys would look at each other like, "Oh yeah, the tin. I remember. I think I know where I hid that. Yeah, that was a while ago." But yeah, it was a very prescribed medication, because one of the things that medicine has known about forever is that it is a fantastic bronchodilator, and it can shut off an asthma attack faster, or at least as fast as an inhaler. So no surprise there. Everybody comes to it in a different way and in their own time. If you do it all, we're not saying it's all things for all people. But what we're going to do here now a little bit is take a quick tour of what we're going to do with this podcast. The world's not at a loss for cannabis podcasts. I think the world is in a place where they'd like to hear some different voices about cannabis, marijuana use. And, my goal with this podcast is to demystify, destigmatize, and let people see from all walks of life that cannabis can fit into a completely healthy and normal way of life. It's more important, though, that we hear from you what you really want to accomplish with this podcast.
Are you talking about our audience or me?
You.
I knew that.
Okay.
When I was a little boy, I would go to events with my dad. I remember driving north from LA up to the San Francisco area or somewhere in between, and meeting a bunch of the current heads of states, as it were. My dad being one of them. Dale Geringer, who was the head of California NORML at the time, Dennis Perrone.
What year are we in about?
We're in the mid-'70s.
Okay.
We're in the mid-'70s. We're probably 72 to 75.
Okay.
Really?
Sorry, buddy.
I'm old.
Yes, you are.
I'm about 7 to 10 years old. Actually, it was probably closer to the mid to late 70s. It was probably 75. At a younger age, 8 years old, I remember petitioning with Dad in San Francisco, little monkey on his arm. But I would go to these meetings, and I, be the monkey in the back of the room now. I was pretty good. I wasn't bouncing off of walls.
Yet.
Well, I was always pretty well behaved. I really was, actually. People used to tell us. Well, my mom used to tell us that people would tell her they were pretty good kids. Anyway, ramble on. I remember watching these people, and they would just fight the whole time. I got to imagine this is what our government's like. Now it's worse. They're ready to go fisticuffs. But back then they were as well. This guy just wanted to smoke weed. Well, this guy wanted all his friends out of jail. And this guy, they were trying to put together like a real intelligent, cohesive California marijuana initiative. And they were. Dad finally fully got involved in 1980 down in LA running the signature gathering part of the campaign in most of Southern California. Massive area. And I discovered that really we need to change this thing from the inside out because, for a long time growing up, all I saw was a bunch of hippies on the corner trying to collect signatures. And I didn't figure after a very short while, initially when I first started collecting signatures, I was too young to legally collect them by myself. And as I was educated, you can be under 18. You just have to be in the presence of another registered voter, and they have to be with you as you register people to vote and get them to collect signatures. I'm sure the law is different now.
Yeah.
I would hope so anyway.
Yeah.
I knew we would have to either dress somebody up in a suit and get literally appoint our own elected officials or elect our own officials, because doing it from the outside in didn't really work for most of it until some really older Together hippies started making TV commercials with disabled people in them, really coming at from an intelligent angle, something that had, the potential to be successful. Kind of sounds sucky to use, a negative connotation to create positivity, but, that's really the way the plant works. You smoke it when you got cancer, it keeps you able to eat, and a lot of people survive and live a long time.
Well, and I think
sorry to ramble.
No, not at all. And I think that does bring up a really legitimate point, though, in that the conversation on cannabis, marijuana, really did start to change when the broader world started learning that there were people who were suffering, who were able to mitigate their suffering, not with a bunch of pills, but with a simple plant. And that being able to treat yourself in a way that keeps you comfortable, increases your quality of life. That's something that suddenly couldn't be denied about this plant. As a disabled person, I don't mind the fact that disability was used as a way to illustrate to the broader public that cannabis has something of benefit to people. I don't feel exploited. As a matter of fact, I willingly used my place in the disabled world exactly for that reason. Why am I being denied use of something that helps me, extends my quality of life? I mean, all these things. So, and I think for the most part, and Chris, you can speak to this as well, the disabled community has been one of the most regular and vocal segments of the population that says, no, this prohibition is dumb. This prohibition actually actively hurts us.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually think across the board, the disabled community, whether it be hemophilia or cancer or any of a variety of different conditions, have largely been the tip of the spear in really making the activism happen. If I could pivot back to an insight that you touched on earlier, Mark, that you had, recognizing that working from the outside in was not an effective way to make change. I've spent most of my adult life as an
I have my doubts now that doing it from the inside out isn't working either.
Well,
so.
Cheer that.
Well, yeah. but there is a good insight there, and you know, in most of my adult life, I've been an activist of one stripe or another, whether it be cannabis or healthcare or environmental concerns, or the arts. I've been involved in a lot of different activism, and I see activist groups make the same mistake over and over and over again, which is throwing rocks at the house from the outside and trying to get people's attention, but then gradually learning how you work the mechanisms and work the levers of power to, and it's you know, you mentioned, you know, we just identified our own candidates and started putting our people into positions where they could make change. That's definitely one step of it. Another step is actually connecting with existing legislators, finding the ones who are open to a change of thinking if you put the information in front of them. But then the most important part, and this is I think what we're getting at here, you know, you talked about the advertising campaigns and things like that, is shifting public opinion. And I think particularly in the area of cannabis, that has been an especially tricky undertaking because certainly back in the 70s, you were still swimming very much upstream against a massive and incredibly effective propaganda campaign that completely mischaracterized cannabis.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, that's not that everything can be blamed on Richard Nixon, but it's a good place to start. Well, and of course, the big thing about Nixon was that he instituted this war on drugs, which was really more a war on segments of the population he didn't like. He used the war on drugs as a way to put down urban Americans, disproportionately black people, and that whole thing goes all the way back to the 1930s with the initial prohibition. But I think what we really want to say about what we want to do with this podcast is we do want to try to affect change from the inside out. And that comes by empowering people with knowledge and with the understanding that anybody can include cannabis in their life in a healthy and a responsible way. And now that we're living in this brave new world, we can do so feeling kind of good about contributing to the economy of our given states and, paying taxes on material, allowing all sorts of people to have a whole new legitimate form of employment, either as growers or working in dispensaries, and really participating in the economy openly, as opposed to how it used to be, where it was its whole own underground economy. And that, for me personally, that's part of the change that I've been fighting for my whole life, is bringing this out in the open and allowing people to feel just as good about growing cannabis as growing corn, wheat, soy, rye, barley, flowers, whatever. So,
well, and if I could jump in, the one thing I would add here is exploring the fact that cannabis goes just beyond smoking weed. The cannabis plant is incredibly versatile, and it's just absurd that we've robbed ourselves of all of the other capacities of the plant in order to practice this weird prohibition that has been driven for the past going on 100 years.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. This is Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer on the Narrowband Broadcasting Network. Hey everybody, this is Andrew Scott, host of Herer'S Victory Garden, the new cannabis-centric podcast featuring Mark Herer. We wouldn't be doing this podcast if it weren't for you, our listeners, subscribers, and supporters. So we're asking you to join in. Got a question, a correction, a topic you want us to discuss? How about a funny story? Email us at talkback@herersvictorygarden.com, and we'll see how your idea or comment can fit into the show. Thanks for your support, and don't forget to like, share, or subscribe. All right, we're back. This is the Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer. I'm Andrew Scott, along with my good buddy Chris Ritter and Mark Herer. And Mark, let's talk a little bit about your dad. This is a long and illustrious story, so everybody strap in. We're going to have a good time. But really, one of the things that I want to know, let's get a little bit of background about your dad and really how he came to advocacy. So many people know Jack Herer as only as a strain. There's a man behind it, and we owe your dad a lot of gratitude. I personally feel that if it weren't for your dad and what he did, we'd be 20 years behind in where we are now, at a minimum. So tell us a little bit about your dad and growing up with him and how that whole thing got started.
Well, I'll try to do my best as far as the short version of how he got involved. But in 1969, when he was 30, he was dating a gal, and he tried smoking pot for the first time. He said he didn't actually get high until the third time. And he said he was seeing things in stereo and hearing things in color, which was like probably the first time I heard a really awesome description of pot was the day that he said that to me.
And your dad was pretty straight-laced back in the day, right?
Until that time, he was pretty straight guy. He was a Goldwater Republican, literally.
Look that up, kids.
Right? Actually, so much so that he and my mom decided they want to name my oldest brother Barry after Barry Goldwater. So they wrote to him and asked him if he would be my oldest brother Barry's godfather, and he was honored. So through the years, I don't remember at all, I assure you. But Mom told me that over the years he would send gifts on accompanied by a letter on his letterhead as a senator, and that was the one box that disappeared when we moved from Florida to LA in 1967. Literally, my mom tells me that. Anyway, so after he got high for the first time, he started seeing everything differently, not only literally but figuratively. He until that time when he would see scenes from conflict on TV, or even get in discussions with people, he totally believed that America was always doing the right thing, that we were always honorable, and we were always doing things because it was the right thing to do. I think pretty shortly after he started smoking, or after the first time he got high,
that wool was pulled off his eyes.
Yeah, they say there are receptor sites in your brain that never get activated unless you put THC in your body. So I would like to think that he, along with numerous other people that I know, they really got turned on for the first time and started paying attention and had the wherewithal and the give a shit to pay attention and listen and start doing a little bit of investigating. I think up until that time, and most of America's except with, and totally not over, worst thing ever still going on today, with racism in our country. But that being said, most people thought America was perfect. At least Americans did.
Yeah, we were the shining beacon on the hill. We won World War II.
Yeah.
The Korea thing is an aside, but
so speaking of that, my dad actually did serve, I think, 2 years in Korea. He was a military policeman.
That's an interesting juxtaposition.
Right. True story. There's a funny picture in the world showing him in his army garb with an MP helmet on and a
I think there's a shot of that in the book, isn't there?
Yeah. Or in the video.
Or the video, that's right. And we'll give everybody more information about how they can get more information on Jack. We'll be talking about that in the future as well. There's a number of books that your dad published, and there's a really great documentary that was done that was financed by Anita Roddick, rest her, a wonderful philanthropist, and narrated by Peter Coyote, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it was great to have somebody of Peter's stature give his voice to the story of your dad. And it's a great documentary, and we'll make sure that people know how to find that as well.
I love his voice.
Oh, isn't it great? He's a fantastic voice actor.
I'm a pretty harsh critic when it comes to people saying anything or putting out into the world regarding my dad. Not that he hasn't earned a lot of his monikers through the years, I'm sure. Because, very rarely do nice people make history.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking more about Jack Herer'S backstory, and we're going to transition over to talking about the book that all brought us here, and that's The Emperor Wears No Clothes. So we'll be right back after this on Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer.
Hey, don't forget to head over to Herer'sVictoryGarden.com and get yourself some great HVG swag, including a personalized and signed copy of Jack in a Box, the definitive Jack Herer collection, signed by Mark Herer himself. That's Herer'sVictoryGarden.com.
Welcome back to Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer. I am Andrew Scott along with Chris Ritter, and we're going to take a few minutes now and explore the reason why we're here, and I say here in kind of the royal way. Cannabis has changed so much in the last 20 years, and so many people have been fighting the good fight for so long. But I personally believe that the vast majority of the traction that we've gotten has to do with a book that I read in high school long before I met you, and that is a book called The Emperor Wears No Clothes. And it was written by Jack Herer, and it was really the first time, at least in my life, it was the first time that somebody told me the absolute unadulterated truth about hemp and cannabis. Not only the truth from a health and use point of view, but just how integral cannabis was in the history of the entire nation. And I'd like to hear a little bit from you about how Dad started writing the book, why he was motivated to write the book, and just some of the history behind it.
For years and years, all of us hippies, we sit around and, we smoke sometimes and, go off into deep philosophical conversations, and different topics come up, and, different, have you ever heard the statistic, 1 acre of hemp is equal to 4 acres of trees for paper pulp production, and various things like that. So in 1980, Dad was running the California Marijuana Initiative, and he was in the process, or he had staged the longest takeover of federal property in U.S. history. For 92 days, he and as many as 100 hippies at any one time were camping out on the federal building lawn in Westwood, kind of deep in the heart of L.A., it's right next to the UCLA campus. And they say it's one of the busiest intersections in the country, at least. The stat I recall back then, this was 1980, and Dad was a great storyteller, but as many as 250,000 people or sets of eyeballs go by that intersection every day. So he figured that was a great place to collect signatures, hold up banners, having people, honk if you smoke
weed. It's a high visibility spot.
Yeah, and he was utilizing it pretty damn well. They had a mess tent set up 24 hours a day, and It was pretty wild. I'm sure all the local people who were hanging out in the federal building were a little pissed off about it. But, it was a peaceful protest, as it were, and they were just collecting signatures. So Dad got a ticket one day for registering voters on federal property after dark. Literally, that was a thing. It was a World War II anti-Nazi, stay indoors at night sort of thing. But he got this ticket, and it was a $5 ticket, and he went to court, and they said, are you going to pay the $5 fine, Mr. Herrer? And he said, fuck you. This is my constitutional right. I don't even get this. So anyway, Dad had ended up doing 14 days on a 15-day sentence in a federal penitentiary in L.A., and that was the last time. So this was in like 1981, 82 that he actually went to jail. So back in that time and era, Dad was known for running up psychotically high phone bills, like literally like $1,000 to $2,000 a month. Tell you can't imagine that because, we're on these plans where everything. So that was the last time Dad was in a space for 2 weeks straight without a phone. So that was the last time he really had, some peace and quiet. So that's when he literally started compiling the book. Initially it was a curiosity because people kept saying, hey, dude, had you ever heard? So, he spent a massive amount of time after that going to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and, creating one of the largest bibliographies in any book ever written. It's pretty ridiculous.
It is heavy on the back end of that book.
He thought it was important to come from a place of fact, which these days is just fake news. But that is when and kind of how he got involved. He was pissed off because he was sick and tired of paying $10 for a lid. That was one of his, like jokingly, originally why he got involved, because he was sick and tired of spending so much money on pot. And then he started finding out the truth, and he was determined to literally change the world.
Was there one, you just said started finding out the truth. Do you recall, was there one thing that Jack discovered, that really lit him up? It was just like, wait a minute.
Tell you what, I don't know if it was one thing so much as kind of everything. So when I was telling you earlier that I'd go to these meetings and sit around as a very young boy listening to all these grown-up or supposedly grown-up adults just fighting and bickering over literally their own private agendas. Everybody had their own agenda, and it's reasonable. I mean, hey, you got into this because it made you feel better.
Sure.
Now, granted, we were all just kids in junior high school and high school, wanting to get stoned at first. Yeah. But as we become older and we realize, I really need to go to work today, so maybe smoking weed all morning before I go to work maybe is gonna, Anyway, so it was everything. Everybody had their own agendas, and I think on some level, Dad just, maybe not so much to suffice everybody's agenda, but why can't everybody win? Why can't the whole planet win? Dad initially, and for a long time, and probably way still after medical became legal, Dad was vehemently against separating medical from personal and the rest of the plant. Dad said that it's going to put this movement at least 20 years behind schedule if we separate medical. And it was about 17 or 18 years until recreational became legal in Washington and Colorado. 6 years ago now?
8, I think.
2 or 4?
Yeah, well, remember, there's a difference in time between the time it was voided and the time that
so,
it hit the ground.
I mean, Dad wanted to legalize the entire plant for everything. Imagine if we were this smart 20 years ago, that we were growing hemp finally 20 years ago. You know, it might have taken a few more years, it's the whole fucking thing with the inside out thing. Now, the best speaker I ever heard on the subject of hemp, slight segue, is Gatewood Galbraith. He was a gubernatorial candidate for governor in Kentucky, like for 20 straight, not cycles, but years, however many, 5, 6 times he ran for governor of Kentucky, pretty much completely under the guises of growing hemp and reemploying all of the farmers. He spoke so eloquently. Dad was a rebel rouser. He's like Captain Hook at the front of the ship, and he's like, no, we're going to go down with the ship, and we're going to go down fighting her. And so I figured when I met Gatewood for the first time that he was our savior, because my dad's just a crazy man, but that's what it took to get people's attention. Dad
this
got
guy's
Gatewood's
running for governor.
Yeah, well, but Gatewood wasn't a screamer. Gatewood was beautiful. He was well dressed. He was 12 freaking feet tall. He was so tall. He was like 6.5 feet tall. And when he would roll, when he would get into this just rap, this political rap that was so beautiful, it's like Vivian McPeak at Hempfest in Seattle. It's just beautiful the way he would speak, and I knew that it wasn't going to be long, and this was in 1990, 30 years ago.
That's something that I want to touch on, though, about your dad and The Emperor Wears No Clothes that personally affected me, was that your dad had a keen eye regarding the overall benefit of this plant to the planet, not just using it medically, not just using it recreationally. He was one of the people that made me understand that this plant is literally woven into the fiber of this country. And we, as a society and a culture, had the wool pulled over our eyes on how important it was. Your dad taught me that cannabis, the word cannabis, is the reason why we have the word canvas. And to 13-year-old me, that blew my mind. And it made me immediately want to go, well, if they misdirected me here, what else have they not been telling me the truth about? And I think that that's one of the things that I personally have your dad to thank for, and it's important.
We were discussing off radio earlier about gateway drugs. And that's always been my mentality is, once a person of any age tries pot, and it is not the evil that, most adults made it out to be, and it would be logical for them to think, what else did you lie to me about?
Yeah.
Just totally logical.
And your dad was kind of a gateway to truth for many people.
Now, I'd like to jump in with a question here.
Mm-hmm.
So, you mentioned the gateway drug sort of trope that has been used in discussions about cannabis. I think that term surfaced, kind of in the 90s. When the war on drugs really took fire.
80s, 90s.
And yeah, DARE was all over the place. And but I mean,
Nancy Reagan, right?
Yeah, for
and
sure.
Rest her soul.
My question is, is there some validity to the point that this plant, has room for abuse, right? There is an opportunity for misuse of cannabis, and that, and I think their position is that potential for misuse outweighs the benefits.
Sure.
And I'd like you guys to talk to that.
One of the things for me that I find really important is to be honest and truthful about this plant. in all directions. And so I think your question is completely legitimate and valid because it's one of the number one questions that gets brought up. Well, if somebody starts using cannabis, what's to stop them from using anything else? Well, in my mind, the answer is nothing. If you have an addictive personality, you're going to find a way to abuse something. It's not the substance that's the issue. It's your addictive behavior. And if you don't address your underlying addictive behavior, you can get addicted to water. And I'm trying not to sound flippant about it. I have addiction in my background, pretty significant addiction in my background. And my personal truth is cannabis has actually helped me in my sobriety from some very, very damaging things. Is cannabis a gateway drug? For some people, it's going to be. For some people, it's not. I would hazard to say that for the vast majority of people, it's not. What cannabis is a gateway to, in my mind, is a way to think differently, a way to be more open, a way to be more compassionate, and a way to look at the world through a different set of eyes. And in my mind, that's nothing but valuable.
Right. I think I see things through a similar lens that first of all, it comes down to the personality and the decisions and the decision-making process, the individual. And if you are prone to addiction, that, it could present some issues for you. And as you rightly point out, I mean, we can be addicted to a lot of things. Look around us today. I mean, we've got vast majorities of people, addicted to social media, and yet nobody's running around saying Facebook is the gateway drug.
Right. Although, boy.
Boy, is it ever.
Mark, you got any thoughts about the whole gateway thing? Or more than that, did your dad have a point of view on cannabis being a gateway to other things?
I can't tell you for sure. I'm sure that he had an opinion on it. Dad had an opinion on everything. But it's hard for me as somebody who has, hell, we're all addicted to something. If it's not tobacco or alcohol, it's pills or, chocolate cake, whatever anyway.
I mean cheesecake.
Keto cheesecake, actually.
I'm sure we'll touch on that at some
We're
point in
going
the
to
future.
touch on keto. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so, I've always felt that it was easily part of the chain. But, when you're a kid and you want something, you're just going to find a way to get it. So everybody gets to experiment. It happens. Thankfully, most people that I've ever spoke to in my whole life didn't go to jail behind their very first experience on almost everything they tried. So it's cool. Anyway, Dad always said, you're not allowed to have an opinion on something if you haven't tried it. So he would make me try everything that he ever offered me. He's like, well, have you ever tried it? I said, no. Well, then you don't deserve an opinion. Try this. It could still be moving, but I had to eat it.
I got to start doing that with my kid.
Yeah, right. It's probably a little late. So, and he also thought that, you're not entitled to an opinion on anything unless you vote. So as far as a gateway drug, I think it's reasonable to assume that it's part of the process, but it's not the first drug any of our kids ever try. We start them out on sugar at a very young age. Then we put them in front of the frickin' television all frickin' day because we don't want to be good parents because we're too busy making money to try to keep them fed and housed.
And now in the video game age.
I
miss Pong.
I've got a great little story.
Life was so easy.
Great little story to that point. My introduction to any illicit substances was at my mom's hip when I was a baby and teething. She would rub vodka on my gums. It was the only thing that worked.
She's a good mom.
Vodka. Anyway. Come on, scotch.
Yeah. Well, right when you first started talking about this subject, I thought back to when I first moved up here full time in January of '99, Portland, Oregon, from LA, I was listening to these two goofy dudes, Mark and Brian.
Yep.
They got simulcast up here, I guess sometime before I got here. So, I knew a couple people up here, but I wouldn't say that I was, thick and friends. So honestly, they were part of my transition. I loved them then, and they're just goofy, stupid, and unfortunately, they don't do it anymore. God bless them. But I vaguely remember hearing about somebody, and I don't want to quote any, it was a radio show. I thought I heard it was theirs, and, no fault, God. There was this contest for these people to see who could drink the most water the fastest, and somebody died from drinking like 2.5 gallons of water in a minute or two.
It's a condition called hyponatremia where you wind up actually diluting your blood of salt, and you wind up going into cardiac arrest.
Yeah. So as far as abusing things, you can abuse anything.
Yep.
So statistically, nobody's ever died from a direct result of smoking cannabis.
No.
There was a case in a prison in Istanbul in like 1892 where some guy had some hash smuggled into him, and he got through like a 2 point something ounces. He was literally eating it. I don't know what his goal was, but it shut down his intestines, and he later died. But anyway.
And actually, what I'd heard on that, too, is that they were thinking that he actually died more of an intestinal blockage than he did from the results of the amount of THC he ingested. And listen, having experimented with eating hash in my younger days,
or Play-Doh.
No, I was a paste kid.
For me, it was paper.
Paper? Okay, yeah. You at least you were smart and got fiber in your diet. I've eaten hash when I was younger. I wished I died, but there's also that very famous quote from Willie Nelson where the only time anybody's ever going to die from marijuana is if a bale of it falls on them.
Right.
And at some point in the future, I do believe that we're gonna spend some quality time talking about some of the real statistics about cannabis, its use, toxicity, things like that. But right now, we're going to roll off to another break. We'll be back in just a little bit on Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer and Chris, my buddy, and I'm Andy, and we'll be back shortly. Hey everybody, Andrew here again, host of the Herer'S Victory Garden podcast. We're proud to be a different, at times more mature voice in the world of cannabis. And in order to keep growing, we could really use your support. If you could, head on over to Patreon and search Herer'S Victory Garden and show us some love by supporting Herer'S Victory Garden with a donation of any amount. Herer'S Victory Garden, cultivating freedom since 1973. Thanks. Now back to the show. And we're back on Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer. I'm Andrew Scott, along with my buddy Chris Ritter. And Chris, you wanted to touch on a couple points here.
Yeah, in the last segment, we were talking a little bit about how the data connecting smoking marijuana to fatalities is very, very thin. At best, and some have made the very bold claim that there is no direct line connection that's been proven. That got me thinking. We've got two very legal, readily available drugs on the market: alcohol and tobacco. And it occurs to me to ask, Mark, your opinion, and maybe if Jack had any sort of perspective on this, what differentiates cannabis from alcohol and tobacco? What's the big differentiator that one is illegal and the others are readily available?
Hysteria, propaganda, probably more propaganda than anything. they say, black jazz musicians would smoke marijuana, and
The
because
Muggles.
the white man was paranoid, and perhaps knew that the brothers were swinging, that their paranoia just wrought horrible things. Mexicans, were smoking it. I think it was the connotation. It was essentially, it's got to be, initially mostly all about the propaganda that was created. Marijuana is a Mexican slang term for cannabis. So, through propaganda, they created, the hysteria and the paranoia, and the myths and disinformation was spread throughout the land and all the lands. I mean, America wouldn't do business with countries that, had legal pot or legal hemp. And if they had it, they pretty much forced them to outlaw it and stop growing it. And, or they wouldn't trade with them. But it's gotta stem from there. Alcohol by this time is one of the strongest businesses on the planet world over. There are a handful of countries that aren't into alcohol, very few. Maybe it's more some religions. I don't know.
No, but I think that's a really good point. You remember, up until recently, we had an entire department in our federal government called the Department of Alcohol and Tobacco. Interestingly, now in the country, in a number of states, we have departments: alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. But I think this points to two very interesting and ugly truths, and that is, cannabis has been affected by race and by the economy. And we will definitely be spending more time on this in future podcasts, because it is a very big and rich field in which to investigate what the real motivations were, why industrial hemp was suppressed in the United States, why simple use was suppressed in the United States. And as you said, a lot of it has to do with the control of the black population, control of the Hispanic population, and needing a mechanism to, I'm not going to mince words, to persecute people. And it's ugly. But right now what we're going to do is we're going to switch over a little bit. We've got some trending news to talk about. And I think number one on our list is welcoming Illinois as the 11th state to have recreational cannabis.
Yay. Welcome, Illinois.
There should be a sound effect for that.
I don't have, I deprogrammed my applause.
You just deleted that one.
Yeah, I did, actually. And I'm new to my board, so there's many bells and whistles, and I don't know how to get the right whistle for the right bell. But, yeah, Illinois is actually a really big shift when it comes to talking about legal recreational cannabis sales. Illinois, I believe, is now going to be the fourth largest, and somebody fact check me, I believe it's going to be the fourth largest state economy to legalize recreational cannabis. And not only did they legalize recreational cannabis, the governor of Illinois has expunged records in the number of the thousands, and somebody can help me out with that number here.
It was 11,000 records, and this is actually the first tranche of up to potentially 116,000 convictions for misdemeanor possession, which is 30 grams or less.
Right.
11,000 pardons for low-level marijuana convictions.
Yeah, which is phenomenal.
And there's a really interesting point on this, that this was not an arbitrary executive act because they passed legalization. He didn't go off and sort of decide to do this on his own. It was actually written into the law that these records would be expunged.
Yeah, and so that was on the foredge of this change. It wasn't, and now we can do this. No, that was built in. We are legalizing in this state, and not only that, we are going to make right what was a huge mistake that affected a disproportionate number of colored people and disadvantaged people, and not only affected them back when it happened, but as is so often the case with cannabis convictions, it affects a person's life going forward. You are denied opportunities, you are denied legal rights and representations at times because of a conviction stemming from nothing more than simple possession.
Right. And the restoration of rights is a really, really big deal. I mean, the sort of sad part of this is they can't give that time back to those people.
No.
But as you say, this is putting it back in the right direction.
Yeah. And I mean, let's just give it up to Illinois for pushing that forward. And we'll definitely have another wider ranging discussion on the petition process, because Mark, that's something that you're really familiar with as far as getting cannabis legislation moved forward.
Yeah, we were discussing what we wanted to do with this show, and I don't know if it was a great idea, but I thought it was a cool idea that we bounce around to, the State of the Union, as it were, in all 50 states. Maybe pick a state to show, because it's easy to get on a soapbox.
I really like the idea.
Lose sight of the ground once you get on that box. I'm never coming down.
Well, and that's something else too. I mean, I remember one of my brothers lives in Arkansas, and when I first moved out here to Oregon, he's like, "Oh man, you're so lucky. You live in a weed friendly state and all this stuff." And I was like, "Yeah, and you know what? My brother, that didn't happen by accident. That happened because people like me and my folks were on the Capitol steps and out on the corners getting signatures to move this forward. And he's all bemoaning that he lives in a place where it was so unfriendly. And I tell him, now's the time for you to get active. Get out there. Do your part. Make this change happen. And he always hemmed and hawed until 3 years ago when Arkansas went medical. And I remember distinctly calling him up saying, "Did you do your part?" And he kind of, and I was like, "Then you know what? You got people to thank because they did it for you." Mm-hmm. So
absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned Arkansas, because when you look at a map of the legalized states, the South actually is lagging behind a little bit, which is very puzzling to me, because legalization of cannabis would represent massive economic benefits throughout the South. Largely agricultural country. That's where a lot of industrial hemp was produced up until, the 40s and 50s, when these propaganda campaigns and the effort to illegalize, the prohibition effort, went underway. They were hit the hardest because that's where a lot of the grow was happening.
Absolutely. And, that brings us to a really complicated, delicate point with the recent, the 2016 and 2019 farm bills.
Sorry to cut you off, but Illinois happens to be one of the states that does not have an initiative petitioning process.
Well, that's actually fascinating, because then that means that came from inside the government.
In the state house.
The state house representatives and government said, "You know what, we might need to rethink this, because there's a whole lot of money rolling into these other states, and we got stuff we want to fund." So, I mean, whether it's from an economic point of view or a social justice and personal rights point of view, change is change. But I think it is interesting to note, and thanks for pointing that out to me, that, this was done without petition.
Yeah, and it's a shining example of change from the inside out. And I can't imagine that legislators in Illinois were not looking at Colorado and saying to themselves, "Wow, 1 year, 2 years into legalization, and Colorado's governor is
literally saying we don't know what to do with all this money."
Yeah, and what he finally landed on, and this is beautiful. I mean, it was a master stroke. they poured the vast majority of that money into the schools.
Into their education system.
Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. And that thrills me. What I was saying really quickly to wrap up this little portion is we have a complicated issue going on with the legalization and the reintroduction of agricultural hemp, because that bill was sponsored by Mitch McConnell. And, you know, again, he's a Southern representative, and there's no arguing that the segment of the population that was leaning on him the hardest to advance this for his state were his farmers, were the constituents that he had, that he needed to go to every day and answer the question, why can't we grow hemp? Mm-hmm. And now we can on a nationwide level, but sometimes you kind of got to be okay with thanking the devil if he does the right thing.
Yeah, if there's one nice thing I could ever possibly say about Mitch McConnell,
And this is it.
and that is that if you look at his career in Congress, he has always had a single-minded focus on bringing the bacon home for his constituents in Kentucky.
Which is the MO of any, you know, elected representative on paper.
Hopefully a good
Right?
at least on paper. it
Right,
should
exactly,
say that,
you know.
right?
And so those farmers found the right button to press.
Right.
And without question. Now I want to switch gears, though, a little bit to something that took me by surprise, and that is Major League Baseball has come out and said that cannabis is okay, that it is no longer on their banned substances list, and that really took me by surprise.
Right.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I mean, I'm thankful on behalf of every single pitcher with a torn rotator cuff who does not want to go down the road of Vicodin,
Right.
and so many other things.
You know, that just unions.
Yeah.
God bless that union.
Right.
I mean, whoever's,
No,
you
the
know,
players' union really.
you know, I know the NBA players union's pretty strong as well, and the NFL, but hell, MLB, I mean, those guys are making bajillions
Yeah,
of dollars.
and honestly, I would argue that Major League Baseball Players Union is the most powerful player representative union in all of professional sports. So for them to actually step up and say, we need to truly represent the interests of our union members. And that means taking on a topic that might not be super popular publicly, but we're going to actually represent our union members. And I not to use the gateway thing, but I'm going to use the gateway thing. I believe that this is gateway to change for a lot of other professional sports, because there are, even outside the bubble of popular culture and how much cannabis is trending in popular culture now, you have the entire medical aspect of cannabis use. And I still personally have a bit of a problem being a sports fan and knowing that I'm being entertained by watching healthy young men grind themselves into dust for my entertainment. And anytime somebody has the ability to treat themselves or a medical condition or their health and well-being with cannabis, I'm all for it. And boy, I want people to have the same benefit that I have and still be able to be healthy, well, and successful in their careers. And I just don't see any reason why the other professional sports aren't going to come online soon because of the path that the MLB has set out upon.
You know, you mentioned athletes, maybe not wanting to wander down the path of Vicodin. Well, talk about gateway drugs. Vicodin is a gateway on up to...
Just talk to Brett Favre.
On up to opioids.
Yep.
And you got me thinking, and it'll be very interesting to watch. I don't think anybody's drawn a clear connection right now between the opioid crisis and the move towards legalization of cannabis, but it'll be interesting to see as we go forward in trying to address the opioid crisis what the implications will be.
We do have
for
statistics that show
legalization.
that in states where there is legalization, there is a reduced number of deaths to opioids, that there is a higher recovery rate for opioid addicts, and that overall states with legal cannabis of one form or another, either medical or recreational, people tend to have lower rates of prescriptions for opioid painkillers and painkillers in general.
Right, and so these,
Nice to have an option.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I think it's important that at some point in the future, I'll bring those actual statistics in. I don't have them in front of me, but I know that that's something that's been coming up pretty regularly.
Right, so it seems like these states are ahead of the curve, in a sense.
It might be by accident, but they still are.
Well, and yeah, I mean, kind of what I was getting at is seeing that actual data come to light and become a driving factor in nationwide legalization, finding its way into the public, into the public sphere, into the political sphere, that people are able, when lobbying for legalization, to march in with a stack of data and say, look at Colorado, look at Washington, look at Oregon, look at California, look at Illinois, New York. We're seeing a concurrent drop in opioid problems post legalization.
Exactly.
Well, I think, going back to unions and professional sports and whatnot, I think as more states become legal, and probably more specifically as more states become recreational, I think it's, you're probably posing a lot of legal issues by continuing to keep pot on the banned substances list. So that's a kind of a curious thought. I wonder, how that's going to infringe on people's rights, not allowing them to do things that are legal, at least in the states where they're going. And once you push past the 50% marker, it's like more often than not, I'm in a place
where it's legal.
Yeah, and
yeah, that's again a whole nother show.
There are amendments involved, I'm pretty sure. So
yeah, lots of moving parts. We're gonna take a quick break, and we're gonna come back with something that I think is going to turn into everybody's favorite segment of the show, and we'll surprise you with it when we get back. This is Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer. I'm Andrew Scott, along with Chris Ritter, and we'll be right back. NBBN,
the Narrowband Broadcast Network.
The focus is on you. And welcome back to Herer'S Victory Garden with Mark Herer. I'm Andrew Scott, along with my buddy Chris Ritter. And now we're heading to a time that I'm pretty sure is going to be a favorite of everybody's. And this is something that we call Story Time with Mark. Hey, YouTube listeners / viewer, Andrew Scott here, host of Herer'S Victory Garden, the podcast bringing you a different approach to cannabis and modern life. Look, we're really pleased you found us here on YouTube, but I wanted you to know that there's a whole extra segment of the show available on our actual podcast. Want to hear about the time Mark and his dad, Jack Herer, wound up with guns in their faces somewhere down south? Well, listen and subscribe to Herer'S Victory Garden via Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your podcast service of choice. Herer'S Victory Garden, cultivating freedom since 1973. Now, let's roll up those closing credits. Your dad meant so much to so many people, and personally, as a guy having known you for now 20 years, knowing you has meant a lot to me and a lot to the people in our community, and we're going to enjoy as we move forward into the future, talking about cannabis and all the things related to the modern life that we find ourselves in now. We are living in a place and a time where darn well half the nation has access to it in some way, and it's only a good thing. But final words, Chris?
Just be kind.
I second that emotion, and light them if you got them. And Mark?
Peace out till next time. Thanks for tuning in.
Cultivating freedom since 1973. This is Herer'S Victory Garden on the Narrowband Broadcasting Network. For Chris Ritter and Mark Herer, I'm Andrew Scott. Thanks a lot for joining. Tune in next time. Make sure to visit us on the web at herersvictorygarden.com. And we'll see you next time. You've been listening to Herer'S Victory Garden, cultivating freedom since 1973. Herer'S Victory Garden is a narrowband broadcast network production in conjunction with PodsquadPDX.com. Andrew Scott, executive producer. Chris Ritter, associate producer. Website design and maintenance provided by VCS Creative. Christopher Vacano, webmaster. Music provided by Ron Kajawa Music. Online at ronkajawamusic.com. Make sure to follow us on social media and online at herersvictorygarden.com. For Chris Ritter and Mark Herer, I'm Andrew Scott. Thanks for listening. NBBN. The Narrowband Broadcast Network. The focus is on you.